Just a line to say I go over the top tomorrow. My company are in the first line of attack and hope to do great things. Naturally, we hope to come through all right, but someone's bound to go under, and it's the only way to end the war. It's a great thing to be in, and I'm glad our division is one of the first chosen to go over. As regards the future, well, I'm ready for it. It has always been my religion to try and play the game. I hope that when the attack comes, my spine will be vertical enough to go through to the finish. And I think you back home will agree with those sentiments.
And at 7:30 on the beautiful morning of July the 1st, 1916, the Battle of the Somme began. If you take the train from Amiens to Arras across northeast France, you will pass through a region deeply linked by emotion and history with the people of Britain. This is Picardy. Through this land in 1415 came Henry V, en route for his encounter with the French at Agincourt. And here, 501 years later, the descendants of Henry's knights and bowmen fought again, in a battle so gigantic in scale that it makes Henry's one-day clash seem like a cockfight in a barnyard. The Battle of the Somme lasted 4.5 months, from the 1st of July to the 18th of November 1916. And during it, approximately 1,200,000 men from France, Germany, and from Britain and her empire were killed or wounded. A traveler at ease in a comfortable express of French railways could be forgiven for not realizing that the innocent landscape through which he was passing once looked like the surface of the moon. What happened here must rate as one of the most monumental and significant battles of modern times, along with such names as Tannenberg, Passchendaele, Alamein, Stalingrad, Normandy. But there was something unique about the Battle of the Somme. All battles are tragic, but this one was particularly so, because it meant, at least for one nation involved, the end of so much innocence and so much hope. Among the soldiers of Britain and her empire who came marching here in 1916, there was a buoyant optimism, a crusading idealism, a genuine belief that something despicable and tawdry was to be swept from the earth, and they were to be the instruments of cleansing. And so these woods and roads behind the lines echoed with the songs that symbolized that buoyancy and that hope. After the battle, the mood was changed. Dismay at the lack of success, bitterness at the deaths, apparently futile deaths of so many men. Before the Somme, they knew, or thought they knew, what they were fighting for. After the Somme, they knew no longer. They were there simply because they were there. There were many who believed that the war would go on and on forever. There is just one other dimension to this story. Disenchantment came very quickly to the British soldiers who fought here. For the first day of the Battle of the Somme was the worst day in the whole history of British warfare. On July the 1st, 1916, there were 60,000 British casualties on the Somme, half of them in the first hour. and 20,000 men died. What took place here is a classic example of what Winston Churchill was to describe as fighting machine gun bullets with the breasts of gallant men. Here, the flower of the war generation fell. And what happened here so shocked one great soldier, who was later to assume high command in the Second World War, that he made it his constant determination that there should never be another Somme. In the words of a soldier writer who fought in France, this was a time when a web was woven across the sky and a goblin made of the sun. The story begins breezily in 1914. Men flocked in thousands to the colors, to have a crack at the Kaiser, to be in Berlin by Christmas, to impress their neighbors, to flutter the hearts of their girlfriends, to get out of their cramping routine lives, but also because they knew, quite simply, that what they were doing was for a king, a country, and an empire in which they totally believed.
Now God be thanked, who has matched us with his hour and caught our youth and wakened us from sleeping. So wrote Rupert Brooke, Cambridge poet and athlete, who died in the war. Not in action, but of blood poisoning. All the hills and vales along, earth is bursting into song. Oh, sing, marching men, till the valleys ring again. So wrote Charles Sorley, killed in action, Battle of Loos, October 1915. We are the happy legion, wrote Siegfried Sassoon, who fought on the Somme and later was to become one of the bitterest critics of the war. And when the summons in our ears was shrill, unshaken in our trust we rose, and then flung but a backward glance and carefree still, went strongly forth to do the work of men. So wrote William Noel Hodgson, lieutenant and bombing officer, 9th Devonshire Regiment, killed in action on the Somme on the first day, age 23.
But graves in foreign fields were not in men's thoughts, as all over Britain the new recruits threw themselves into the soldier's life.
I was only 16. The recruiting sergeant asked me my age, and when I told him, he said, "You'd better go out, come in again and tell me different." I came back, told him I was 19, and I was in. When I told my mother, she said I was a fool and she'd give me a good hiding. But I said, "I'm a man now. You can't hit a man."
The whole empire was stirring. Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, South Africa were rallying to the flag. Even little Newfoundland raised its battalion and sent it hurrying over to Britain. They were to be heavily involved in the first day on the Somme. With Britain's regulars and territorials already engaged across the Channel, Kitchener's newly raised battalions eagerly prepared for their own ultimate confrontation with the enemy. But the patriotic spirit had yet one other trick to play. Certain towns and cities, mainly in the industrial north and Scotland, raised their own battalions and offered them to the nation. They had no uniforms, no weapons, no depots, but they had one superlative asset. They had comradeship. They were, in the currency of the time, pals, and that was what they called themselves, pals battalions. These are men of the 15th Battalion, West Yorkshire Regiment, but they were always known as the Leeds Pals. The 16th West Yorks, the 1st Bradford Pals. These are men of the 13th Yorks and Lancs, the 1st Barnsley Pals. This battalion had its own particular title. Officially, the 10th Lincolns. It was always, to its members, the Grimsby Chums. Others were essentially Pals battalions, but took a more formal name. This was the Sheffield City Battalion. This battalion, raised by the local Chamber of Commerce, was the Hull Commercials. And the same volunteering spirit prevailed, with numerous local variations, throughout the mainland of Britain and in Ireland. It was indeed a marvelous idea. Friends going side by side to war. Members of the same community, the same factory, the same tennis club, the same football team, sticking together through thick and thin. But nobody seems to have thought at the time of the devastating effect on a city or town if its Pals battalion suffered heavily in action, if they not only fought together, but died together as well. But such thoughts did not occur in the euphoria of the time. It was, said one pal, like a holy war.
All the air was ringing with rousing assurances. France to be saved, Belgium righted, freedom and civilization re-won. A sour, soiled, crooked old world to be rid of bullies and reclaimed for straightness and decency. Everyone had within him the hope of approaching that far-off, longed-for ideal, the passport to France.
And so they came to the Western Front. It stretched 450 miles from the Swiss frontier to the English Channel. It became a special private world which could only be understood by those who were there. One writer called it that great livid wound that lay across Europe. The photographers of the time responded to it. Inevitably, the war artists attempted to interpret it. Both produced images that have become significant documents of our times.
And here at Vimy Ridge, just north of the great battlefield of the Somme, is a fragment of that Western Front, preserved as a memorial to the men who fought and lived here. The sandbags, of course, are concrete. So are the duckboards. The British soldier would have given a lot for duckboards as solid and reliable as these, and for sandbagging as tidy and secure. So that this picture, perhaps, is not quite complete. Add to it, first the noise. Shells rushing like great trains through the sky. The deadly rattle of machine guns. And the possibility, even in the quiet times, of the sudden spit of a sniper's rifle. Add next the sound that was to become so dreadfully familiar to those who were here. The cry for stretcher bearers. Add next the smell of chloride of lime, rotting sandbags, cordite fumes, and sometimes poison gas. And add frequently mud, as thick as caramel and deep enough to drown a man. And in the winter, the cold, incredible, bitter cold. But add something else as well. The amazing resilience and good humor of the men who fought and lived and died in these holes in the ground. The companionship that sprang from privation shared and from danger faced together. And the ecstatic pleasure of simple, ordinary things. The smell of frying bacon, the relaxing haze of cigarette smoke. As one of them wrote, did not a mess tin of stew or a tot of rum or whiskey and water in a tin mug taste more like divine nectar than the best champagne drunk out of the finest cut glass? But no humor could disguise the fact that this was a killing ground. where men were kept month after month in inhuman conditions, compelled by the united wills of great nations to use every resource to outwit and kill each other. Men who in their ordinary lives, as one old campaigner said, had never even struck a child or kicked a dog.
It was not until 1916 that war came in earnest to Picardy and to the region of the Somme. Formerly held by the French, this had been a quiet sector, a backwater. There was little evidence of active warfare. The trenches were, in the jargon of the time, cushy. But now, in 1916, the Somme was chosen as the setting for a great new offensive. The British and French would build up their strength here and attack side by side. As the British began to move south into Picardy in the early months of 1916, the pace of war began to quicken.
The philosophy here, much favored by the French, had been live and let live. Occasionally, enemy soldiers came across each other getting water or bathing, neither side wishing nor willing to start something. But the British generals didn't like these unspoken agreements between enemies. This was merely playing at war. They favored the doctrine of the offensive. Dominate no man's land. Keep the Hun on his toes. The German wire is our front line. But the prevailing mood was, on the whole, relatively quiet. So much so that when the inevitable preliminary bombardment began before the battle, one German grenadier put on his best uniform, went to his company commander and said, "Who has started this stupid shooting? In God's name, someone is going to get hurt." Indeed, British generals had every intention that someone would get hurt, particularly Germans.
The generals who were to play the most important roles on the British side in this coming battle were Sir Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief, and Sir Henry Rawlinson, his commander on the Somme. Though often suspicious of their French allies, they gave the forthcoming joint attack their full support. They had reckoned without Verdun. In February 1916, the Germans attacked this strongly defended city halfway between the Somme and Switzerland. The French fought back, and the Battle of Verdun became one of the unforgettable epics of the Great War. One observer who flew over it saw a sinister brown belt, a strip of murdered nature. It seemed to belong to another world. Every sign of humanity had been swept away. Fresh troops approaching Verdun heard what sounded like a gigantic forge that never stopped day or night. It bled France's army into the ground. They could not now throw their full weight into the forthcoming battle on the Somme. That would have to be a predominantly British affair. And it put on the British a formidable obligation to show in attack on the Somme the same dog-like tenacity that the French had shown in defense at Verdun. So the final plan emerged. The French would attack with 5 divisions astride the River Somme. The British would attack with 14 divisions over the open downland to the north, where the German front line ran through a series of village fortresses. The names of the villages: Montauban, Mametz, Fricourt, La Boisselle, Auvieux, Dieppe-Val, Beaumont, Hamel, Serre, Goncourt. These names were to become bitterly familiar to the British soldiers who fought here. But it was not so intended. They were to take these villages in a morning and break through into the open country beyond. And if the best came to the best, the cavalry would advance along the line of the old Roman road through Pozières and on toward Bapaume. All through the spring and early summer of 1916, the British came marching to the Somme.
It was a very beautiful countryside then. Flowers growing, birds singing. I think that was one reason one didn't feel particularly afraid. Because when the sun is shining, you feel much more brave than when you're ploughing through the mud and snow. I also saw it 2 years later, and there was not a tree to be seen.
This little town, Albert, stood behind the center of the British lines here. It became for the Somme what Ypres was for the battlefields of Flanders, a base, almost a kind of capital. Countless battalions tramped through its streets on their way to the front. This great church, the Albert Basilica, became the supreme landmark of the Somme battleground. And this statue, the Golden Virgin of Albert, became a symbol, almost a mascot for the soldiers here. Struck by a German shell in 1915, it hung over the shell-damaged streets of Albert for 3 years. If it fell, the soldiers said, the war would end. It did fall in 1918. But it was from here that the Battle of the Somme, at any rate in its catastrophic early stage, was directed. The Chateau of Carrieux, 13 miles behind the British lines. It was to General Sir Henry Rawlinson, commander of the British Fourth Army of 400,000 men, that Sir Douglas Haig gave the responsibility of planning the opening attack. Rawlinson's headquarters were here. To begin with, the Somme was his battle. In the last weeks before the battle, this place swarmed with activity. Red-tabbed staff officers hurrying hither and thither. Haig or a posse of French generals arriving for lunch. Telephones ringing. Dispatch riders on roaring motorbikes rushing instructions to the forward headquarters controlling the 195 battalions of Rawlinson's army.
In these elegant rooms, the decisions were taken which were to make the attack of July the 1st, 1916, an inevitable disaster. The plan was basically very simple. There was to be an artillery bombardment of colossal intensity, lasting 5 days. It would annihilate all life in the German trenches. Nothing, said General Rawlinson, at a conference held here shortly before the attack, nothing could exist at the conclusion of the bombardment in the area covered by it. There would therefore be no need for the British infantry to rush the German lines. There would be no need for them to leave their heavy equipment behind. At 0 hour, they would rise from the trenches, fully loaded, and simply walk across no man's land. Now, this method of advance in broad daylight would make them perfect targets for enemy machine guns. But then the enemy machine guns would not be there.
But the enemy machine guns would be there. The German trench system here was excellent. They had built deep dugouts into the chalk. These could be 40 feet below ground with several alternative entrances and tunnels running back to the next trench. And, for the officers at least, lavish accommodation. Here they would be able to live through the great bombardment that was to come. And from here they would emerge at the very moment that the British artillery barrage lifted from the German front line.
Ironically, the British knew the kind of dugouts the Germans were building. The French had captured one intact near here in 1915. The British were using it as a company headquarters. But this was somehow ignored as the plans for the great attack were worked out. And there's a further twist to the story. The Germans knew quite well the attack was coming. By observation, by routine intelligence, all Britain was alive with rumors of the great push, and by simple deduction. They knew the Allies were about to strike, but they did not know when. But this knowledge, too, was to be given them in the end.
And then the bombardment began. There had never been a greater. It was planned to last 5 days, but the attack was postponed 48 hours because of bad weather, and so it lasted a full week. It was even audible in London. Watching it, men were awed by its power. Surely these shells would destroy the thick belts of barbed wire guarding the German trenches. Surely no one could live through this inferno.
The whole air throbs with the sound. It seems to come in huge, sudden stabs. The Hun is getting it in the neck at last. It seems an extraordinary game. But the only thing to do is to go on and try and biff the Boche. We're all very cheerful and confident.
But there were those who didn't share this optimism. One such was Lieutenant Colonel Sands, officer commanding the 2nd Middlesex. His men were due to make their attack up this depression. The soldiers called it Mash Valley. There was another valley, Sausage, not far away. Nowhere on the whole front was no man's land wider, and the Germans were securely dug in on 3 sides. On the rising ground to the left, the Orville Spur. At the head of the valley, 750 long yards away, and on the higher ground to the right, on the main Albert-Bapaume road. It seemed clear to Colonel Sands that not even the unprecedented power of the British bombardment could entirely eliminate the enemy resistance in this strongly held sector. He could not sleep. At night, he prowled endlessly through the camp where his men lay bivouacked. During the day, he spent hours at an artillery observation post, watching the barrage and staring at the German wire half a mile away. The frightening suspicion grew in his mind that the wire was not cut and that his men would be marching into disaster. He conveyed his fears to his brigade commander. He was told to keep quiet. Had not the general officer commanding said that the wire would be cut? Had he not said nothing could exist at the conclusion of the bombardment in the area covered by it? Colonel Sands was to become one of the sadder casualties of the first day on the Somme. This, too, was part of no man's land, and in its own way, as deadly as Mash Valley. Across there, the British front line ran through Mansell Copse, where the Devonshires were dug in. Among the officers, the young poet, William Noel Hodgson. Their objective in the first assault was to be a heavily fortified stronghold in the German line, the village of Mametz. And there, at a particular point, the enemy had installed a machine gun in the village cemetery close by the crucifix. A colleague of Hodgson's, a young company commander, Captain Duncan Martin, an artist, had gone on leave shortly before the battle. He had taken with him a large-scale map of the area and had amused himself by constructing a plasticine model of the battlefield. And the more he looked at it, the more it seemed inevitable that that machine gun would play havoc with his battalion's advance. On his return to the front, he showed the model to his brother officers and told them what he feared would happen. As with Colonel Sands, Captain Martin's premonition was to become reality.
In the last few days, at many points behind the 18-mile battlefront, the generals addressed their men. Their mood was buoyant and optimistic, though they did not disguise the certainty of heavy casualties. Occasionally, they angered the soldiers instead of encouraging them.
Our general said that if anybody hung back and stayed in the trenches, there'd be somebody there to shoot them. We didn't like that, because we were all eager. The last thing in the world we thought of was dodging the column.
All through the last days of June, the build-up continued. The tension mounted. The great attack was now only hours away. Men prepared themselves for battle. As the guns thundered on, this young officer, Second Lieutenant Roland Ingle of the 7th Lincolns, wrote his thoughts in his diary. He faced the possibility of his own death.
The men who are going to be knocked out in the push, there must be many, should not certainly be looked on with pity, because going forward with resolution and braced muscles puts a man in a mood to despise consequences. He's out to give more than he gets. And a man who's used to sport takes things even in the great chance of life and death as part of the game.
Second Lieutenant Roland Ingle was to be killed in the very first moments of the attack on July the 1st. But others viewed the prospect of battle in a different light. This man, Arthur Hubbard, a corporal of the London Scottish, wrote home on the 29th of June,
"Hope we shall be successful on Saturday morning, July the 1st, at dawn, when you are all fast asleep, in driving the Huns out of their present position, and without any bad luck to myself. I have got to go over in the first batch. I should be in my glory if the news came through to cease firing and pack up. I can imagine how everything looks at home, and the garden, as you say, must be almost at its best."
Arthur Hubbard was later sent home with shell shock. 11 years later, he took his own life. Opposite Mametz, in the trenches of the Devonshire Regiment at Mansell Copse, Lieutenant William Noel Hodson, poet and bombing officer of the 9th Devons, and colleague of Captain Duncan Martin, wrote his last poem.
I that on my familiar hill saw with uncomprehending eyes 100 of thy sunsets spill their fresh and sanguine sacrifice, ere the sun swings his noonday sword, must say goodbye to all of this, by all delights that I shall miss. Help me to die, O Lord.
Now, from their billet villages in the rear, the attacking battalions came marching up.
We were massing to go over the top, fateful words for all infantrymen. We were intensely excited, but quietly confident. The timid were less fearful, the bold more exultant, and all were thrilled and intensely alive on that evening of the 30th of June. No bands, no bugles, not even the raucous voices of sergeants as we moved off.
At Senlis, the 1st Dorsets had a final meal together before the push. Imitating the well-known toast of their enemy, they rose and drank to Der Tag, the great day. The Newfoundlanders marched up from Louvaincourt. They had been popular here, and many local people gathered in the village street to wish them au revoir, with, says their official regimental history, doubtless many a silent prayer for their safe return. After the usual 200 yards of marching at attention, the commanding officer gave the signal to march at ease. Rifles were slung, and almost simultaneously, every officer and man in that long column broke into the well-loved strains of "Keep the Home Fires Burning."
Till the boys come home, there's a silver lining through the dark brown sky.
Near here, a War Office cinematographer recorded the march up to the front of the 1st Hampshires, who, like the Newfoundlanders, were to attack at Beaumont Hamel the following day. Every single officer and 3 out of 4 men in this battalion would be killed or wounded next morning. Instinctively, in the presence of the camera, they turned in the kind of cheerful performance that would go down well on cinema screens back home. This was Tommy Atkins going happily to battle. San Ferrian, cheerio, chin chin, tickled to death to go. In fact, few felt heroic, but there was a certain exhilaration, and their companionship was strong.
I have a lasting memory of the man who was closest to me as we marched. I was only 18 at the time, and he was some years older than I. I became aware of a feeling of tenderness in him towards me, as though he sensed my fears, and was trying to reassure both himself and me. "Don't worry, Bill," he said. "We'll be all right."
But sometimes a less reassuring note was struck. At one point, men marching to the front heard a voice shout,
"You came of your own accord. You didn't have to be fetched. You bloody fools."
But at times, even the most stalwart must have felt a twinge of misgiving. Here, just behind Serre, men were marched past freshly dug wide trenches, graves ready for mass burial. Such preparations were a necessary part of the ritual of battle, They were not good for morale, but they were to be justified by events. Meanwhile, in his headquarters at Carrier, General Rawlinson and his staff busied themselves about the 11th hour details of the master plan. At 10:17, Rawlinson issued this message to his troops.
In wishing all ranks good luck, the Army Commander desires to impress on all infantry the supreme importance of helping one another and holding on tight to every yard of ground gained. The accurate and sustained fire of the artillery during the bombardment should greatly assist the task of the infantry. Not perhaps the most inspiring communication. There was no Nelson touch here. Nevertheless, worried staff officers hastened to pass it on to all the units under Rawlinson's command. At La Boisselle, one officer, afraid that the message might not get through to the attacking units because of the crush in the trenches, transmitted it by field telephone, even though such use was strictly forbidden by security regulations. It was picked up by the enemy's listening devices. The Germans' knowledge of the British attack was now complete.
In his diary, Rawlinson wrote, "What the actual result will be, none can say, but I feel pretty confident of success myself, though only after heavy fighting. The issues are in the hands of the bon Dieu." July the 1st broke fine and clear with just a hint of mist in the valleys. It was going to be a beautiful summer's day. The weather, wrote Second Lieutenant Siegfried Sassoon, was of the kind commonly called heavenly. The birds were singing. Many men recalled afterwards that even at the height of the battle, the larks were audible through the noise of the guns.
It was really a pity to have a war on July the 1st, for in all my time in France it was the most beautiful day we had. The sky was cloudless and the sun shone. The skylarks were singing as they flew heavenwards. And unknown to them, thousands of our soldiers were on their way there too.
All along the 18 miles of trenches, men prepared themselves for 0 hour. Some men managed to sleep, but for others, such relaxation was impossible.
Now the men were ready, waiting for the crucial moment when their barrage would lift and give them the freedom of no man's land, where no one had walked in the open in broad daylight for nearly 2 years. That was the plan. That was the promise. In this frontline trench were men of the Accrington Pals and the Sheffield City Battalion. Their objective, the village of Sayre, just over the hill. They were soldiers of great pride and confidence. But they had heard disturbing stories of night raids on the German lines, which had found the enemy defenses secure and the enemy barbed wire intact. But information of this kind, running counter to the optimism prevailing at the time, had little chance of reaching battle headquarters. There was to be no change of plan. They were to proceed with the attack.
They went through their final rituals. Bayonets fixed, they moved forward to the assault trenches. Not all men took it with such professional calm as these regulars of the Lancashire Fusiliers at Beaumont Hamel. In one battalion, a man went berserk and had to be held down. Elsewhere, men who had taken too much at the usual 11th hour distribution of rum fixed their bayonets with much laughter and bravado. Now, in this usually peaceful backwater of northeast France, the stage was set for battle. But there was one last trick to play before the soldiers went over the top. Deep under these fields, mines had been laid, 10 in all, prepared at vast expense in labor and some loss of life. All but one were to be exploded under the enemy at 7:28, 2 minutes before 0 hour. By the arbitrary decision of the local corps commander, the Hawthorne Redoubt mine here at Beaumont Hamel was to be blown at 7:20. This was to prove a costly decision. But it would no doubt make a splendid picture, and the official cinematographer, Lieutenant Geoffrey Malins, was duly on hand. The film he took has become one of the most familiar images of the Great War.
Any second now. It seemed to me as if I'd been turning for hours. The horrible thought flashed through my mind that my film might run out before the mine blew. Then it happened. For all the world like a gigantic sponge, the earth rose into the air. Higher and higher it rose, and then, with a horrible grinding roar, the earth fell back upon itself, leaving in its place a mountain of smoke.
In fact, this picturesque image of the war is also a symbol of bad judgment and failure. It provoked a heavy and completely unexpected artillery barrage on all the British trenches in the area. When the attack began, 10 minutes later, the Germans were poised and ready.
At last the moment had arrived for which the young men of 1914 had volunteered. Men in their 20s, in their 30s, boys in their teens, for all of them. This is what they'd trained for. This, at last, was the big push, the crack at the Kaiser. Fred Carnot's army showing the Boche what for. Junior officers who might have been at school the year before stood looking at their watches, whistles in their mouths as the last seconds ticked away. Now the war was no longer in the hands of the generals and the commanders, but in the hands of these young men.
This is the opening moment of the Battle of the Somme. One fragment of one sector of an 18-mile front along which countless scenes like this one were being enacted, as 66,000 men from 84 battalions of the first wave rose from their trenches and advanced into no man's land.
It was supposed to be a walkover. The Germans, after all, were not supposed to be there. They had, after all, been pounded by the greatest bombardment in history. No one, the general said, could possibly survive. But deep in their dugouts, the Germans had survived. And at the instant that the last colossal bombardment lifted toward the German reserve lines, they swarmed up from their underground shelters. And they brought their machine guns with them.
Up the hill marched row upon row of heavily laden soldiers, walking steadily, doggedly forward. One soldier later recalled, "At first we strolled along as though walking in a park. Then suddenly we were in the midst of a storm of machine gun bullets, and I saw men beginning to twirl round and fall in all kinds of curious ways as they were hit."
Men suffered a whole range of emotions. Astonishment, anger, numbness, terror, disbelief. But the discipline held. They went on.
In the excitement of the moment, some Germans stood on top of their trenches, regardless of their safety, to fire into the soldiers approaching steadily uphill. All along the British line, men could be seen throwing up their arms and falling. The advance crumpled. The waves of British infantry broke helplessly against the wall of the German defense. A young subaltern, Charles Carrington, who witnessed this first attack on the Somme, wrote that for the onlooker, battles of the First War were rarely spectacular. A great noise and a smoke cloud filled the valley, in which now and then one saw distant figures moving, aimlessly it seemed, like ants in a disturbed anthill. A war photographer took this picture of the attack on Beaumont Hamel. The time was 7:45. These are the remnants of the 16th Middlesex falling back. 2/3 of this battalion were already casualties. This picture is, in fact, the record of a massacre. 10 miles to the south, another photographer took this picture of the attack on Fricourt, where a similar desperate story was being acted out. Watching the action which this photograph records, Second Lieutenant Siegfried Sassoon wrote in his notebook, "Fricourt, half hidden by clouds of drifting smoke, blue, pinkish, and grey. I'm looking at a sunlit picture of hell." And this is the country near Mametz shortly after 0 hour. From near Mansell Copse, a war photographer recorded the attack of the Gordon Highlanders. These tiny figures against the chalk are men in the extreme tension and agony of battle. And here, near the old Roman road at La Boisselle, was played one of the many tragic stories of that day. Precisely at 0 hour, the Tyneside Irish Brigade rose from their trenches 1 mile behind the British front line and advanced over this open hillside toward the distant enemy. This photograph records their advance as it began. The men close together, no breaks in formation. An officer who saw them remembers the sun shining through the early morning mist and glinting on their bayonets. Then the machine guns struck, and men began to fall. But the pattern of the march was maintained to the beat of a single drum. They went on out of sight. The Tyneside Irish Brigade, 3,000 strong, was finally reduced to less than 50 effective men.
Everywhere between the British and German lines lay huddled khaki figures. Many of them, dreadfully wounded, slowly and helplessly died. Some of them crouched in shell holes, trapped between the fear of going back and being shot for cowardice and the fear of going forward to certain death. They were stunned by the savage, unexpected resistance. Of many battalions which fought here, it was to be said they were 2 years in the making and 10 minutes in the destroying.
What, meanwhile, of the Newfoundland battalion, who had marched singing from Louvencourt the night before? What happened to them on July the 1st came to mean so much to the people of that small colony that later they bought from the French that part of the battlefield where their soldiers were engaged. It has been preserved as a permanent memorial to these men.
They were not in the opening assault. They waited in reserve trenches while the battalions of the first wave broke vainly against the uncut German wire. Then orders came from the rear for a second attack with 2 battalions in a further attempt to breach the enemy lines. They and the 1st Essex were ordered to advance. The regulars of the English battalion did so cautiously, advancing slowly through the crowded communication trenches toward the British front line. The Newfoundlanders, by contrast, impelled by the urgency of their orders, went straight over the top from their reserve lines. They were the only figures moving in the whole landscape. The survivors of the first attack being by now helplessly pinned down in no man's land, so that even before they reached the British front line, they began to fall. More experienced or less resolute men might easily have given up and taken shelter. Under such impossible conditions, the Newfoundlanders marched on.
From their trenches, a quarter of a mile away, the Germans saw the easy target of a mass of men moving steadily forward across open ground and bunching as they made their way through the widely spaced gaps in their own barbed wire. It's said that as they marched out into no man's land, they tucked their chins into their shoulders against the hail of bullets, as though they were facing into a blizzard of the Newfoundland winter. 91% became casualties. All 26 officers and 658 out of 726 men were killed or wounded. They achieved nothing. Writing of the disaster, their divisional commander praised them in the currency of the time. It was a magnificent display of trained and disciplined valor, and the assault failed of success because dead men can advance no further.
It was a day of much bravado on the British side. Opposite Serre, the Germans were astonished to see an English officer calmly leading his men into battle, wielding nothing more lethal than a walking stick. And here in these open fields between Mametz and Montauban occurred an event which was to become legendary. Captain Wilfred Neville, East Yorkshire Regiment, temporarily attached to the 8th East Surreys, conceived the idea of launching his battalion's 2 leading companies into the attack as though it were a football match. As the whistles blew for 0 hour, they kicked 2 footballs out into no man's land. Neville and his men followed. Neville himself, an eyewitness said, smoking and joking as he walked. But it was not merely an exhibition of English coolness. In Neville's idea, there was an elementary psychology, in that it gave the men something homely and familiar to concentrate on as they went over the top.
This escapade was to be taken up enthusiastically by the press and to do great things for civilian morale. The Illustrated London News gave a double-page spread to their war artist, Mr. Caton Woodville. His drawing was even reprinted by the Germans, who, in captions printed in a dozen languages, mocked the event as an example of English absurdity. But Touchstone, poet of the Daily Mail, gave it the accolade of a poem, entitled, with distinct echoes of the public school spirit, The Game.
On through the hail of slaughter, where gallant comrades fall, where blood is poured like water, they drive the trickling ball. The fear of death before them is but an empty name. True to the land that bore them, the Surreys play the game.
But Captain Neville did not live to enjoy his unexpected international fame. He lay dead just short of the German line.
Yet the attack here, of which the Surreys were a part, was the one success of the day. Here the British right wing and the French took all their objectives and found themselves staring out over the unspoilt, thinly defended country beyond. But no orders came to advance. No cavalry swept across this open land. It would later take weeks of bitter fighting to win what was there at that moment for the asking. But everywhere else along the front, it had been a day of almost unmitigated disaster. There had been great gallantry, and in some sectors, deep advances into the German lines, on the strength of which certain divisions, like the Ulsters at Thiepval or the London Territorials at Gommecourt, would gain a heroic and proud reputation. But the upshot was the same. The enemy had thrown back the British attacks almost with ease. Meanwhile, in Mash Valley, Colonel Sands, who had stared at the enemy's barbed wire day after day, saw his battalion cut down. Himself wounded, he was evacuated to England. 2 months later, haunted by the belief that he should have done far more to save his men, he took his own life. At Mansell Copse, Captain Martin lay dead, killed by the machine gun under the crucifix, as he had predicted. Lieutenant William Noel Hodgson, poet, was also dead. At battalion roll calls that day, men listened with mixed emotions. There was grief at the death of friends, but the strongest feeling was bitter disappointment, for they knew now that the war would be long and hard. At Carrier that evening, Rawlinson had before him a confused but broadly correct picture of the day's events, except in one respect, the true number of casualties. He would live to fight subtler battles than this, would indeed become one of the more successful of that much criticized group of men, the generals of World War I. But this was not his hour.
By any standards, it must have been, for General Rawlinson, a very disappointing day.
The first casualties from the Somme reached London on Sunday, July the 2nd. These were not the worst cases.
None were dangerously wounded. On the contrary, they were able to accommodate themselves in the Red Cross wagons, private motor cars, and taxicabs without the assistance of doctors and nurses. Their spirit was magnificent. Full of smiles, they were in the jolliest of moods. Now we shan't be long, they said, as they were whirled away to hospital.
And the newspapers were equally optimistic. A success had been expected, a success was duly delivered. Now the Kaiser had been shown what for. Now, surely, we were on our way. And then the newspapers began to tell a different story. As day after day, through the long, hot summer weeks, they printed column after column of the dead, wounded, and missing. Now was the time of telegrams, of the drawing down of blinds, of streets, schools, churches, factories, clubs, plunged into mourning. Now the letters came from France in their thousands. I am thankful to say your son did not suffer. Your brother will be deeply missed by the officers and men of his company. Your husband was a good soldier and died doing his duty. And now those communities which had cheered their men to war in 1914 and 15 saw the other tragic side of the coin, as local pride turned overnight to local grief. There would never be any more PALS battalions. The whole idea had died in one day in Picardy. By late August, the people of Britain had the opportunity of seeing something of the battle for themselves, as a new official film was released to the nation's picture palaces. The King commended the film. At its first showing, a message from the Minister of War, Mr. Lloyd George, was read out. This film's cause and purpose is that everyone at home and those abroad shall see what our men at the front are suffering for us. Herald the deeds of our brave men to the end of the earth. To the Illustrated London News, these were the most wonderful pictures ever taken, but the Bishop of Durham demurred. He thought of the shock of seeing a loved one living on the film who was now dead in a corner of France. To him, this entertainment was of a kind which wounds the heart and violates the very sanctity of bereavement. Others applauded the appropriate and well-rendered music with which it was usually accompanied, although some disapproving voices complained of the showing of comedy films in the same bill.
By September, the film was being shown here on the Somme, just behind the lines in a field near Molencourt, with Charlie Chaplin as a supporting feature. A lieutenant colonel who came to see the Chaplin film arrived, as he tells us, only in time for the more harrowing part of the entertainment. He found it a most realistic and wonderful production, but, he added, it must of necessity be wanting, in that the battle is fought in silence, with the most unpleasant part, the machine gun and rifle fire, entirely eliminated. And yet, on this occasion, loudly audible in the distance, was the continual roar of the real battle.
All through that summer, the battle ground on, through the autumn and almost to the edge of winter. The hopes of breakthrough faded as every village, wood or copse, every feature in the landscape became the center of dogged fighting. Now it was lead and iron against flesh, and there was no glamour in this confrontation. War as glory and dash became discredited forever, and in its place the image of the Great War that is commonly accepted today became established. The war of doomed battalions of infantry going over the top, of men who died as cattle. This was not how the Somme began. Then there were real hopes of a rapid and glorious advance. Now the generals used a new word, attrition. They would fight forward inch by inch and yard by yard. They would wear down the German army, and they would accept the necessity of huge and continuing losses. Now new names began to make their impact on the battalions fighting here, like Delville Wood, which they nicknamed Devil's Wood because of its murderous reputation, or High Wood, which to the soldiers advancing painfully across the scarred plateau seemed like a dark cloud on the skyline. It is still dangerous to enter today. And near here in September, the British used an entirely new weapon, the tank. There was a flurry of hope. Surely this would end the war. The tanks brought only a brief success. The battle continued. Men coped as best they could with the inhumanity which surrounded them. An artillery signaller, Harry Bateman, was here throughout the whole battle and made these drawings. Sometimes they catch the casual moments, the bawling out of "Take me back to dear old Blighty" during what he calls evensong in the gun pits, or supper in the wagon lines. But mostly he is obsessed by the violence, by the prospect of action, and by the dead. This picture is called "Getting the Dead for Burial," Thiepval Wood, 1916. And in the corner, the words, "This Hell's Parade." This, untitled, is Harry Bateman's vision of no man's land. This remarkable artist was later invalided out of the army following utter exhaustion at the end of the battle. He thought little of these drawings and scarcely ever looked at them again. He died in January 1976. Others turned to vicious and angry poetry.
Who made the law that men should die in meadows? Who spake the words that blood should splash in lanes? Who gave it forth that gardens should be boneyards? Who spread the hill with flesh and blood and brains?
Sergeant Leslie Coulson, whose last poem this was killed in October 1916, aged 27. Meanwhile, the arguments began of the conduct of the battle. Churchill wrote, "We have not conquered in a month's fighting as much ground as we were expected to gain in the first 2 hours." General Haig defended this strategy. Pressure on Verdun relieved, proof given to the world that the Allies were capable of maintaining a vigorous offensive. Heavy losses inflicted on the enemy. The offensive was maintained. With the autumn, both sides were confronted with another belligerent, the rain. It sapped men's energy and it turned the battlefield into mud. As the battle became bogged down, two attitudes began to emerge among those that fought here that would never be reconciled. For some, this was the turning point. One young officer took this view.
The Somme battle raised the morale of the British Army. Although we didn't win a decisive victory, there was, what matters most, a definite and growing sense of superiority over the enemy, man to man. We were quite sure we'd got the Germans beat. Next spring, we would deliver the knockout blow.
Yet for many others, there was no such hope. Their old idealism had vanished. They saw only the carnage and the endless sacrifice. In the words of one old soldier,
The Somme was just slaughter.
there was a final spasm of fighting in November in the valley of the Somme tributary, the Ancre, when Beaumont Hamel, where the Newfoundlanders had fared so tragically in July, was wrested from the Germans. The main advance to the east petered out here, at the side of the old Roman road and still 4 miles short of Bapaume. This old burial mound, the Butte de Wallencourt, was where the last confused fighting took place. It was then a dome of gleaming white chalk from which all the vegetation had been blown away by shell fire, and which seemed to the British soldier an object of menace and terror.
It was as good a place as any to call a halt to the slow slog eastwards. In 140 days, they had advanced just 7.5 miles. In the words of the Prime Minister, Asquith, the long procession of cruelty and suffering was over.
The Battle of the Somme is commemorated by over 120 Commonwealth War cemeteries. Some are only for the dead of certain battalions, like the cemetery of the 2nd Gordon Highlanders near Mametz. Or the Devonshire Cemetery at Mansell Copse. When the bodies of the fallen Devons were first buried here, a notice was put above the graves. The Devonshires held this trench. The Devonshires hold it still. Some bring together the dead of many regiments and nationalities. Men from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, as well as the homeland of Britain. These stones, the symbols of who knows what unfulfilled promise. Yet here and there a name stands out. In this cemetery on the Guillemont Road lies one of the known losses of the Somme. Raymond Asquith, son of the Prime Minister, killed in action September 1916. Of this scholar, orator, and wit, John Buchan wrote that he was a man endowed with every gift except one, length of years. Small time, but in that small, most greatly lived this star of England. And there are the countless ordinary men, like Private Albert Barker of Hull, so keen to be a soldier that he lied about his age and died on the Somme aged 16. Or Lieutenant Henry Webber, who joined up as an act of solidarity with his 2 soldier sons and died on the Somme aged 68, the oldest British soldier to be killed in action in the war. Or Private Alf Goodlad, Sheffield City Battalion, who thought the French were a grand nation, worth fighting for, and died for them as well. And then there are the 73,000 missing of the Somme. Their bodies lost or blown to pieces by shellfire. Their names inscribed on this imperial arch at Thiepval. There are many French cemeteries here too, for Frenchmen died on the Somme in their thousands, in spite of their nation's greater sacrifice at Verdun. And there are German cemeteries, a mere handful compared with the British and French. For it is the victors and not the defeated in war who have time and occasion to honor their dead. Late in 1916, a new song was being sung by the soldiers in France. They sang it as they took their turn in the pulverized trenches of the Somme. They sang it as they went off to other sectors, where other historic battles would be fought in 1917, with huge losses, some gains, much heroism, and more disillusion. They sang it with the same resigned cheerfulness, the same mixture of pride and cynicism with which they sang most of their songs in that war. "60 years after," a survivor wrote, "there can never be another war like the Great War, nor the comradeship and endurance we knew then. I think perhaps men are not like that now.